August 27th, 1979. The northwest coast of Ireland. A Tuesday morning, so clear and still that locals said you could see all the way to the horizon without a cloud in the sky. A 79-year-old man, one of the most powerful figures in 20th century British history, steps onto a 28-foot wooden boat in a public harbour. No armed guards, no security detail, no protection of any kind. Just a family outing. Lobster pots and sea air. And somewhere on the cliffs above, a man with a radio transmitter is already waiting. At 11:39 in the morning, 50 pounds of gelignite hidden beneath the floorboards exploded. The boat is gone in seconds. And the British royal family will never, not for a single day, feel safe again. This is the story they never told you properly. Stay with me, because it only gets darker from here. If this kind of deep dive forensic royal history is what you're here for, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button, subscribe to Jenny Exposes, and ring that notification bell. I put serious research into every single video, and I need the algorithm to know you're watching. Now, let's get into it. To understand why this assassination mattered, why it shook the monarchy to its absolute foundations, you need to understand who Lord Mountbatten actually was. Not the Wikipedia summary, the real picture. Because this was not simply a senior aristocrat who happened to be related to the Queen. This was the man who had, more than almost anyone else alive, shaped the modern British royal family from the inside out. His full name was Louis Francis Albert Victor Nicholas Mountbatten, 1st Earl Mountbatten of Burma. Born at Frogmore House in Windsor in 1900, great-grandson of Queen Victoria. His family name at birth was Battenberg, a German name, which became deeply uncomfortable during the First World War when Britain was fighting Germany. So the family anglicised it. Battenberg became Mountbatten, a name change that erased a heritage but preserved a dynasty. His career was extraordinary by any standard. He served as a Royal Navy officer and rose through the ranks with a combination of genuine talent and extraordinary royal privilege. During the Second World War, he was appointed Supreme Allied Commander of the Southeast Asia Theatre. He was overseeing the liberation of Burma while his cousin was still a princess living under wartime restrictions. And then, in 1947, came arguably the most consequential chapter of his public life. He was appointed the last Viceroy of India, the man responsible for overseeing the end of British colonial rule over the subcontinent and the birth of two independent nations, India and Pakistan. A process, I should say, that historians have spent decades arguing about, because the speed of that partition led to one of the most catastrophic humanitarian disasters of the 20th century. Somewhere between 200,000 and 2 million people died in the violence that followed. That context matters. The IRA knew it. The world knew it. Back in Britain, Mountbatten became First Sea Lord and then Chief of the Defence Staff. He was, in the clearest possible terms, at the absolute apex of British military and political life for decades. But his real power within the royal family was personal, not institutional. He was the uncle of Prince Philip. And it was Mountbatten who is widely credited with arranging the introduction between the young Prince Philip and the future Queen Elizabeth II. He essentially engineered the marriage that produced the line of succession we know today. And then there was his relationship with Prince Charles. This is where it gets genuinely emotional. Charles's own father Philip was, by most accounts, a cold and demanding presence in his son's life. Mountbatten stepped into that gap. He became a mentor, a confidant, a surrogate grandfather. Charles himself described him, in his own private journals, later published in the authorised biography by Jonathan Dimbleby, as the grandfather I never had. That phrase, written by a 30-year-old man after losing the person who understood him best. That tells you everything about the magnitude of what the IRA did that morning in Mullaghmore. So why did the Provisional IRA choose Mountbatten? Let's be honest about this, because there is sometimes a tendency, particularly in British media, to treat this as pure barbarism with no strategic logic. That's not accurate. The IRA made a calculated choice, and understanding that choice is how you understand the full weight of August 27th, 1979. The troubles in Northern Ireland had been escalating since 1969. A decade of bombs, shootings, reprisals, internment without trial, Bloody Sunday in 1972, and a British government that the IRA believed had no genuine intention of ending its presence in Northern Ireland. By 1979, the Provisional IRA was conducting a sustained campaign of violence against British military and establishment targets. They were not simply throwing bombs randomly, they were issuing political statements in blood. Mountbatten, in their analysis, was the perfect statement. He was a cousin of the Queen. He was a former viceroy, the physical embodiment of British imperial authority. He was a senior military figure. He was beloved by the royal family. And here is the critical detail that makes this entire story so infuriating to examine in hindsight. He had a catastrophic security weakness that he had been warned about repeatedly for years. And he did nothing about it. Every summer, for 30 years, Mountbatten had vacationed at Classiebawn Castle in County Sligo, on the northwest coast of the Republic of Ireland, just south of the Northern Ireland border. And every year he kept his boat, Shadow 5, in the public harbour at Mullaghmore. A 28-foot wooden vessel, no lock, no guard, no surveillance. Anyone could walk up to that boat in the middle of the night, climb aboard, and do whatever they liked to it. Everyone in the village knew it was his boat. Everyone in the village knew he went out on it almost every morning when the weather was good. The Garda Síochána, the Irish police, had been warning Mountbatten for years that he was a target, that the IRA had him in their sights, that the border location, the unguarded boat, the predictable routine, all of it combined to make him extraordinarily vulnerable. His reported response, and this has been documented in subsequent Garda reports, was essentially dismissive. He is said to have indicated that the IRA would not harm an old man on holiday. He believed, genuinely believed, that his age, his civilian status at that moment, his sheer audacity in simply being there without guards, would somehow protect him. He was catastrophically wrong. And here is where the story becomes almost unbearable. In the days before the attack, the specific days before August 27th, an Irish police corporal filed a report. He had spotted a car with Belfast registration plates near the harbour. The driver had been observed watching Shadow V. The car was later identified as one previously used in the transport of IRA explosives. That report existed. That warning existed. No action was taken. The boat remained unguarded, and the Mountbatten family went ahead with their morning trip as planned. The man who built the bomb was named Thomas McMahon. He was 31 years old, a carpenter by trade from County Monaghan. But within the Provisional IRA's South Armagh Brigade, he was known as one of their most experienced and technically competent explosives officers. He had been arrested twice previously on IRA membership charges and acquitted both times. He was not a man who made careless mistakes. On the night of August 26th, the night before the assassination, McMahon and a second IRA volunteer, named Francis McGurl, entered Mullaghmore harbour. There was no one to stop them. No guard, no camera, no alarm. They boarded Shadow V. McMahon attached a 50-pound radio-controlled gelignite device to the underside of the wooden deck, directly beneath the area where Mountbatten was known to sit. Then they left. The boat was returned to exactly how they had found it. Nobody saw anything. And now comes the detail that makes this story genuinely strange, almost cinematic in its timing. By 9:55 the following morning, a full 1 hour and 44 minutes before the bomb detonated, McMahon and McGurl had already been arrested. They were pulled over at a routine Garda traffic checkpoint 80 miles from Mullaghmore. McGurl couldn't produce identification or proof of ownership for the vehicle. Standard stop, standard detention. They were taken in on suspicion of vehicle theft. The guards at that checkpoint had no idea who they were, no idea what they had done the night before, and no idea that a bomb was sitting on a boat 80 miles away, waiting for a radio signal. The two men sat in custody, and at 11:39 in the morning, someone on the cliffs above Mullaghmore sent that signal. The explosion was immediate and total. Shadow 5 was destroyed in an instant. The blast was heard across the harbour. Witnesses on shore described watching the boat simply disappear into a cloud of smoke and debris. The water around the site was littered with wreckage. There were 7 people on board that morning. Lord Mountbatten himself, his daughter, Patricia Knatchbull, and her husband, John, his 14-year-old twin grandsons, Nicholas and Timothy Knatchbull, Patricia's mother-in-law, Dowager Lady Brabourne, 83 years old, and a 15-year-old local Irish boy named Paul Maxwell, who had been working for Mountbatten as a summer boat crew member, a part-time holiday job that a teenager from the area had taken on. Paul Maxwell, 15 years old, from County Fermanagh, dead, because he happened to be crewing a boat for a man the IRA wanted to kill. Lord Mountbatten was pulled from the water. His injuries were catastrophic. His legs had been nearly severed by the blast. He was alive when he was pulled out. He died before he could be brought to shore. Nicholas Knatchbull, 14 years old, was killed by the blast itself. Dowager Lady Brabourne survived the initial explosion, but died in hospital the following day. That is 4 deaths: Mountbatten, his grandson Nicholas, Lady Brabourne, and Paul Maxwell. The other 3, Patricia, John, and 14-year-old Timothy, survived, but with severe and lasting injuries. Timothy Knatchbull would spend decades carrying the weight of what happened that morning. He eventually wrote a memoir about it, titled From a Clear Blue Sky, about the experience of losing his twin brother in that explosion, feet away from him, on a calm August morning in 1979. It is one of the most harrowing accounts of loss you will ever read. But here is what even many people who know the story of Mullaghmore don't fully appreciate. The same day, the same afternoon, 5 hours after Shadow 5 was destroyed, the IRA detonated 2 roadside bombs at Narrowwater Castle near Warrenpoint in County Down, ambushing a British Army convoy. 18 British soldiers were killed, 16 of them from the Parachute Regiment, the same regiment associated with Bloody Sunday 7 years earlier. 18 soldiers in a single afternoon. It was the deadliest single attack on the British Army during the entire Troubles. The IRA had planned both operations to occur on the same day. The message was not subtle. They were not conducting a military campaign with Mountbatten as an incidental target. They were making a statement about the breadth of their reach, the sophistication of their coordination, and the cost they were willing to impose on Britain. August 27th, 1979. The single bloodiest day for the British military and royal establishment in over a decade. And it all came down to a wooden boat in an unguarded harbour. Now, let's talk about how McMahon was caught, because this is genuinely extraordinary forensic work that deserves to be told properly. He had already been arrested before the bomb went off, but suspicion of vehicle theft is not a murder conviction. The case against him was built entirely on physical evidence. Dr. James Donovan, Ireland's most senior forensic scientist at the time, led the investigation. Garda divers went into 30 feet of water off Mullaghmore and recovered debris from the wreckage of Shadow 5, including fragments of the bomb mechanism itself. Green and white paint that matched Shadow 5's hull was found on McMahon's clothing and boots, clothing that had been confiscated when he was detained that morning, before the explosion. Traces of nitroglycerine and ammonium nitrate, the key components of gelignite, were found on his jacket. And sand. Sand from Mullaghmore Beach, specifically, was found in the treads of his boots. He had been arrested 80 miles away at the moment of detonation. But the forensic evidence placed him on that boat the previous night with absolute clarity. Thomas McMahon was tried before the Special Criminal Court of Ireland in November 1979 and convicted of the murders of Lord Mountbatten, Nicholas Knatchbull, Dowager Lady Brabourne, and Paul Maxwell. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. His co-accused, Francis McGurl, was acquitted. The evidence against him was insufficient for conviction. McMahon never showed public remorse. He gave an interview to the BBC years later that was clinical and cold, in a way that many viewers found deeply unsettling. He acknowledged what he had done. He framed it as an act of war. He served 19 years. He was released in 1998 under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. That is the price that was negotiated for peace, the release of convicted paramilitaries from both sides. Whether you think that price was right or wrong, it is what ended the Troubles. McMahon walked free. The Knatchbull family had to live with that. The funeral was September 5th, 1979. Lord Mountbatten had, with characteristic precision, planned his own funeral years in advance. He had specified the music, the Royal Navy hymn. He had reportedly requested that there be no tears. Westminster Abbey was full. Queen Elizabeth II was there. Prince Philip was there. The entire royal family attended. And Prince Charles, 30 years old, having lost the man he described as his surrogate grandfather, was visibly, publicly, devastated, in a way that those who knew him said they had never seen before. He was not a man given to public displays of grief. That day, he could not contain it. In his private journals, published later by his authorized biographer Jonathan Dimbleby, Charles wrote that Mountbatten's death had made him understand that life had to be lived fully because nothing was certain. That grief sharpened his sense of urgency. And here is something that several royal historians, including Sally Bedell-Smith and Penny Junor, both of whom have written extensively on Charles, have argued with some conviction. His marriage to Diana Spencer in 1981, which came just 2 years after Mountbatten's death, was at least partly shaped by the emotional pressure of that grief. Mountbatten had, in his lifetime, actively encouraged Charles to settle down and marry. The pressure to produce an heir, combined with the raw grief of losing his closest mentor, may well have pushed Charles into a marriage before he was ready. We know how that ended. Now I want to address something directly and honestly, because if I don't, you'll find it in the comments and you'll wonder why I didn't mention it. There has been, in recent years, a significant reassessment of Lord Mountbatten's private life, and not a flattering one. In 2019, FBI files released under the Freedom of Information Act described Mountbatten in terms that were deeply damaging to his reputation. Allegations about his personal conduct and sexual behaviour were included in those documents. And separately, civil litigation connected to the Kincora Boys' Home scandal in Northern Ireland has involved claims about Mountbatten. These are serious allegations, and they deserve to be acknowledged honestly. However, the Northern Ireland Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry, which reported in 2017, formally and specifically rejected some of the most serious allegations made against Mountbatten in connection with Kincora. Other aspects of these claims remain in active legal proceedings. The picture, in other words, is genuinely unsettled. I am not going to tell you that the man was a saint. The historical record clearly doesn't support that framing. But I am also not going to present unverified allegations as established fact, because that would be dishonest. What I can tell you is that the investigation is ongoing, that the inquiry has rejected specific claims, and that the full picture may take years more to emerge. This channel deals in documented history, and on this particular dimension of his life, the documentation is still being written. What is not unsettled, what has never been in question for a single moment since November 1979, is the fact of what happened on Shadow 5. The bomb, the forensic evidence, the conviction, the 4 people who died. That is documented, verified, and closed. In 2015, 36 years after the assassination, Prince Charles visited Mullaghmore Harbour. He was the first member of the royal family to return to the site of his mentor's death. He met with local residents, including some of the people who had been on the shore that morning in 1979 and had pulled survivors from the water. And on that same visit to Ireland, Charles met with Gerry Adams, the leader of Sinn Féin, the political face of a movement that had been directly responsible for the murder of the man Charles loved most. That meeting was described by commentators across the political spectrum as one of the most significant gestures of post-Troubles reconciliation ever made by a member of the British royal family. Whether it was an act of genuine forgiveness, or careful political theatre, or both, only Charles knows. But he went. He stood in that harbour. He shook that hand. And if you understand what happened on that boat in 1979, you understand exactly how much that moment cost him. What did the assassination of Lord Mountbatten actually change? Let's be precise about it, because there is a tendency to speak in vague terms about tragedy and legacy without getting specific. Here is what changed. The monarchy's casual relationship to personal security ended permanently on August 27th, 1979. Before that morning, there had been a culture, particularly among older members of the royal family, of treating heavy security as unnecessary, intrusive, or somehow beneath their dignity. Mountbatten embodied that attitude completely. 30 years of summer holidays in an exposed location, an unguarded boat in a public harbour, a predictable routine, repeated warnings, repeatedly ignored. After his death, that attitude became impossible to sustain. Every subsequent royal security protocol, every decision about public access and private travel, every risk assessment, all of it was shaped by what had been demonstrated so catastrophically at Mullaghmore. The institution learned, at the cost of 4 lives, that it was not untouchable, that its members could be reached, that the IRA was not going to make exceptions for age or sentiment or the wishful thinking of a 79-year-old man who believed his reputation would protect him. Mountbatten had left every door open. In the most literal possible sense, he had left his boat unlocked, in a harbour anyone could enter, in a village anyone could watch, accessible to anyone with a radio transmitter and the will to use it. The royal family, after his death, began locking every door he had ever left open. Not just physically, institutionally, psychologically. The whole apparatus of royal protection changed because of that Tuesday morning in Sligo. He had been warned for years. He had been guarded by no one. And on the day he died, nothing about the institution that survived him would ever be the same again. That is the story of Shadow V. That is the story of Lord Mountbatten, of Thomas McMahon, of Nicholas Knatchbull and Paul Maxwell, and a 15-year-old boy who was just doing a summer job. It is a story about arrogance and warning signs ignored, about forensic science that caught a man 80 miles from the explosion he had engineered, about a royal family that lost its closest confidant and never quite recovered the innocence that morning took from it. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of viewer I make these videos for. Genuinely, thank you. Hit the like button if this was worth your time. It genuinely helps this channel more than you'd think. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there is a lot more of this kind of documented forensic royal history coming. I don't deal with rumours. I don't sensationalise what doesn't need sensationalising. The facts here are extraordinary enough on their own. I'll see you in the next one.